went to my son Mark's parent-teacher conference on Thursday, November 4th, and I saw all his teachers, and Mr. Lascala for social studies showed me a book called Religious Intolerance. And this is about Jewish immigrants who came to the United States from 1881 to 1914. This is like my deceased grandfather, Max Rosenstock, was like one of them, and also Dora Rosenstock. And we have a nice book. This has about pogroms, and it has also, it's from Russia. They came from Austria, but the background is pretty similar. Now, it says, in this print, Jewish refugees are on a boat bound for New York, and below is Ellis Island, opened in 1892 as America's new immigration center. Castle Garden, the first center, could not handle the growing number of immigrants. And choosing America. Throughout its history, America has been known as a symbol of choice and freedom. Since the late 1700s, many American citizens have been free to follow their religious and political beliefs. They have been free to move from place to place and to settle and work where they please. People in countries all over the world heard of this freedom and were drawn to America. Some immigrants came from places where they had no say in how the government ran their country. Others came from places where they were persecuted for their religious beliefs. From 1881 to 1914, about 2 million Jews came to America from Russia. They came in search of political and religious freedom. The Jews in Russia. Jewish settlements have existed all over the world, including in parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe, for thousands of years. During the 1700s, there were large Jewish communities in Russia. This was a time when Russia was becoming a powerful empire by conquering neighboring lands. It was also a time when anti-Semitism in Russia was widespread. By the early 1800s, the Russian government had created laws that limited the Jewish people's rights. For example, Jews were only allowed to live in certain areas, known as the Pale of Settlement. Fueled by the anti-Semitism that existed, Russians sometimes attacked Jews. These attacks were known as pogroms. I heard about the pogroms because I was told by my family about them, and about everything that happened to not only our family and our descendants, but also to others in similar situations. On March 13th, 1881, terrorists killed Russian Tsar Alexander II. After his death, anti-Semitism became even more widespread. Many Russians blamed the Jews for his death because one of the terrorists was a Jew. In the unrest that followed the Tsar's death, pogroms became more common. Hundreds of Jews were killed during this time. In May 1882, the Russian government used the violence and unrest as an excuse to pass a series of laws. These laws further discriminated against the Jews. These so-called temporary laws included reducing the area of the Pale of Settlement by 10%. Jews were still forbidden from living outside this area. Also, Jews were not allowed to work as lawyers or in government. Getting out of Russia. As life became more unpleasant for the Russian Jews, many of them decided they could no longer live in Russia. They began to hear stories about the opportunities that existed in America. However, leaving Russia was not easy in the late 1800s. The Russian government made it hard for people to get passports to leave the country. It was even harder for the Jews, whose movement the government especially tried to restrict. Officially, Jews were restricted from travel. Unofficially, government officials would help Jews get passports for a certain amount of money, known as a bribe. Many Jews were poor and had to leave Russia illegally, sneaking across the Russian border. Arrival in America. In the late 1800s, it took immigrants between 2 and 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic in steamships. Western Europeans traveled in cabins because they usually had more money. Jewish immigrants had to travel below deck because they could not afford the more expensive tickets. They slept on iron bunk beds padded with straw. Most of them were too seasick to eat, and there was not a lot of drinking water. When the ships arrived in America, the immigrants were taken to Castle Garden or to Ellis Island after 1891. Those two islands were used by the U.S. government as centers to receive immigrants. Immigrant aid societies. The Jews in Western European countries, such as Germany, France, and England, and in America, wanted to help their fellow Jews escape Russia. They created societies in Europe and in America, such as the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society and the Jewish Colonization Society. These societies collected money from Jews all over the world to help the Russian immigrants pay for their journey to America. They arranged for the Jews in various European cities to bring the Russian Jews from the train stations to the ships heading for America. In America, the societies helped the immigrants by operating kitchens to feed the new arrivals. Jobs in America. Many Jews from Russia found work as peddlers. Immigrant aid societies or other friendly Jews in America sometimes gave the newly arrived immigrants some money to buy goods to sell. The peddlers would then walk around carrying his goods or pushing them on a cart. Other Jewish immigrants found work making clothing, which was easy to learn. The garment was made in sweatshops, which were small, crowded, dirty rooms. The sweatshops were often located in the tenements where Russian Jews lived. Jews usually worked long hours to make a living, often 12 to 15 hours per day. The rooms were hot in the summer and cold in the winter. Other Russian Jews found work in factories on assembly lines.
Very good.
Life in the cities. Most of the Jews who came to America from Russia in the late 1800s settled in such port cities as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where the steamships landed. By the time the Russian Jews arrived in the 1880s, there were already about 250,000 Jews from other parts of the world living in America. Most were settled in New York City. The Russian Jews found jobs and Jewish communities in New York and other cities. However, even though they found jobs and a sense of community, there was a period of adjustment for many of the Russian Jews. They worked hard to exist, often living in crowded, rundown, and dirty houses. Children and community. The Russian Jews saw education as a way to escape the hard conditions. Parents worked long hours and saved money so that the children could go to school instead of having to work like other children at the time. The Russian Jews placed a lot of faith in their children. They did everything that could make sure their children's lives would one day be easier than their own lives were. Jewish worshiped together in synagogues. They also watched Yiddish theater together to provide relief from the hard living conditions. Yiddish theater, which was a very popular type of drama performed in the Yiddish language, strengthened the Jewish sense of community. Success and choice in America. Although life for the new immigrants was hard in America, it was still better than life in Russia. They joined the Jewish communities that already existed, making them stronger. The Jews in America worked hard to make a better life for themselves and their children, and it paid off. Many of them successful in their new homes. Famous descendants of Russian Jews included songwriter Cole Porter and writer Saul Bellow. Other descendants became great actors such as Dustin Hoffman, sportsmen such as Hank Greenberg. Some, such as Emma Goldman, were political activists. Jews were free to choose how to live, to worship, and to work. They proved that America was indeed a land of freedom and choice. Then there's a glossary, but you know what? Make that enough, otherwise they won't allow it on YouTube. It'll be too long. Okay, save it.